unfold.
Okay, so let's dive into the incredible, almost unbelievable story of how one of the 20th century's biggest moments wasn't planned. It wasn't strategized. It wasn't even ordered. It was, for all intents and purposes, a complete and total accident.
We all have this mental image of the Berlin Wall falling, right? This epic, historic moment, a triumph of freedom. But what if I told you that whole thing happened because of a series of chaotic blunders? A tired, poorly briefed official, and a single misunderstood word.
That's right. This wasn't some master plan cooked up in Washington or Moscow. Nope. This was a cascade of failures that somehow, accidentally, changed the entire world in the span of just a few frantic hours.
Now, to really understand how this incredible accident could even happen, we need to go back and feel the immense pressure that was building inside East Germany in the autumn of 1989. The whole state was cracking at the seams.
So the regime was getting squeezed from two sides. On one hand, you had the exit crisis, just a mass exodus of its own citizens, escaping through any crack they could find in the Iron Curtain. And on the other hand, you had the voice crisis. These were the people who stayed behind, but were now finding their courage, filling the streets and demanding change.
So the leadership, they come up with this desperate, pretty cynical plan. They called it the valve solution. The idea was, hey, let's just open a tiny valve, let the most discontented people out for good. They thought it would release the pressure and let them save their own skins. They never, ever intended to open the floodgates.
And that brings us to the moment that lit the fuse, a painfully dull, routine press conference led by a tired, and this is the crucial part, a very poorly briefed party official named Günter Schabowski.
Right before he walked into that room, somebody handed Schabowski a piece of paper. It detailed some new travel rules. But here's the thing. He wasn't in the meeting where they discussed it, and his boss totally forgot to tell him the most important detail. The new rules weren't supposed to be announced until 4 a.m. the next morning.
So for almost an hour, it's just mind-numbingly boring party rhetoric. Then an Italian journalist, Riccardo Ehrman, asks this really pointed question about a previous failed policy. And Schabowski, he's a little annoyed, wants to announce some good news, and he remembers that note in his pocket, so he pulls it out.
He starts reading from this dry, bureaucratic text, and you can just imagine the air being sucked out of the room. He has just announced that anyone can leave, through any border crossing. The journalists are just stunned.
The reporters, their minds just racing, immediately sense how huge this is, and they all start shouting out the most important question of all. A simple three-word question that would change everything. When does it start?
And here it is, the fatal slip. Schabowski shuffles his papers, he's kind of fumbling around, and he mutters the words sofort unverzüglich, immediately, without delay. You see, he saw that word unverzüglich in the text, but it was meant to describe how quickly visa applications would be processed later on. He just applied it to the entire law. He had just accidentally announced the immediate opening of the Berlin Wall.
Okay, so a mistake in a press conference is one thing, but it took the incredible power of the media to turn that one little error into a self-fulfilling prophecy that could not be stopped. Just look at how fast this thing snowballs. At 7:05 p.m., the first wire report hits. By 8 p.m., less than an hour later, it's the top headline on West German television. And just 30 minutes after that, thousands of people are acting on that news, turning a mistaken announcement into a mass movement on the ground.
This broadcast right here, this was the real turning point. You have to remember, most East Germans trusted West German TV way more than their own state media. So when this famous anchor declared, in the present tense, that the gates are wide open, they believed him. They put on their coats, they grabbed their keys, and they went to go see it for themselves.
Okay, so let's move to the flashpoint, the Bornholmer Strasse border crossing, and the one man who was forced to make an impossible choice that would decide the fate of a nation.
So this guy, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Jaeger, he was a loyal 25-year veteran of the border guards. He's at work, eating a sandwich in the break room, when he sees Schabowski on TV. He literally chokes on his food and yells bullshit at the screen. He knew the rules. He knew this was impossible. So he starts frantically calling his superiors for orders, but the chain of command was already falling apart.
The thing is, Jaeger was completely trapped. His bosses gave him no clear orders. They basically abandoned him to face this growing crowd all alone. And he realized he was being set up. If he opened fire, he'd be the butcher. If he opened the gates, he'd be the traitor. No matter what he did, he was going to be the scapegoat.
By 11:30 that night, this is how many people were pressed against his gate. Over 20,000. 20,000. Angry, hopeful, determined East Berliners, all chanting, "Open the gate! Open the gate!" His men were terrified, outnumbered 1,000 to 1.
With zero orders from above, fearing his men were about to be crushed, and unwilling to start a bloodbath, Jaeger made the decision himself. He turned to his guards and gave the order that effectively ended the Cold War in Berlin. "Open the barrier, we are flooding now." And with that, the physical barrier was breached. Within an hour, every single crossing in Berlin was wide open. And not because of some top-down order, but because of the total and complete lack of one.
What happened next? I mean, it captures the surreal joy of that moment. People who'd been separated for almost 30 years were just pouring into each other's arms. And the feared border guards, the very symbols of oppression, they just stood aside and watched as the world they knew collapsed in a giant party.
So when you really break it all down, the system failed at every single level. First, a drafting error. A poorly written note created chaos. Second, a communication error. A failed briefing led to a premature announcement. And third, a command error. A cowardly leadership structure just collapsed, leaving a mid-level officer to make a world-changing decision all by himself.
So, what's the big takeaway here? Well, it's a powerful reminder that history isn't always neat and tidy. It shows us that sometimes the choices of a few ordinary people, caught in a moment of pure chaos, can have a far greater impact than any grand plan ever could.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other major historical events weren't the result of meticulous planning at all, but were really just accidental miracles, driven by human error, confusion, and a little bit of improvisation?